So today I think I'm going to be doing a book review. Well, not so much a book review because I am so not in a place to really critique anybody else's work, especially when it's a like nationally slash internationally acclaimed book. I'm not the one to review it. I'm so aware of that. But I will do a book analysis on, I guess I wonder if this is going to be flipped or not. Like I think it's going to be flipped. So it's Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid. I read this in one of my English classes and was required to write an analysis about it. And yeah, I absolutely loved it. I loved the book. It was really interesting, and I'm not going to get too far into the plot line because if you're here for the analysis, you've probably already read Lucy, or you might be a student like I was who needs some perspective on it, because I also went to YouTube to hear people's reviews and, takeaways and their own little analyses about the book. And yeah, I kind of came to my own conclusion, wrote a pretty dang good paper on it that the teacher asked if I would be willing to share as an example to her future classes. And I said yes. Enough bragging. This is going to be an analysis on Lucy, specifically the allusions to Paradise Lost by John Milton. We're going to get right into it. And right off the bat, I'm going to say, despite her physical absence throughout the book, Annie Potter, which is Lucy's mother, is the most influential character in Jamaica Kincaid's Lucy. Lucy, her daughter, and the novel's main character, obviously, put an ocean between herself and her mother in hopes of kind of severing ties and starting a new life in America, one that was free of her mother's grasp, which she very often, I won't even say complains about, but like has nightmares about. Thoughts of her mother are shrouded in bitterness. Her memories evolve into rage. Letters that she sends to her mother, letters that her mother sends her go unopened. And yet Annie Potter remains an omnipresent and kind of intrusive force in Lucy's life. So between kind of tumultuous expressions of both resentment and longing, Lucy repeatedly refers to her mother as godlike, depicting herself as in a position of either like subject or adversary to this entity that is her mother. So the complicated nature of their relationship, which is like the concurrence of both love and hate and heritage and autonomy, kind of define Lucy's narrative as it plays out in the book. So the author, Kincaid, she does employ a number of different literary allusions throughout the text that emphasizes the themes and kind of provides some perspective for Lucy's internal conflicts, and boy, are there a lot of them. But I think right off the bat, the one at least we discussed the most in class, was the William Wordsworth poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and it's about dandelions and stuff. It's, I think English, but Kincaid uses that to kind of serve as a critique to the colonial education that Lucy had back where she grew up in the West Indies. So Lucy basically, and I won't go too far into this because this isn't the main text we're going to talk about, but she grew up having to memorize the poem back when she was in the West Indies. And it's a colonial poem. I think Wordsworth was English. And so they're talking about daffodils and stuff like that Lucy's like, I'm never going to see this crap ever. Like, that's not here. Why are we learning about England? Why are we having to subject ourselves to learning this literature that doesn't relate to us and never will whatsoever? Like, feels weird. So, it enrages her. But mentioned far less is John Milton's Paradise Lost, but it is mentioned, and I think it is the most important literary illusion in Lucy. So this epic poem from the 17th century isn't mentioned until halfway through the final chapter. It dramatically kind of epitomizes the novel's most difficult themes, which is Lucy's relationship with her mother and also her own identity. Both resemble that of Lucifer and God. So Lucy discloses kind of like a laundry list of different grievances that she has about her mother throughout the whole book, from like minor irritations to just emotional agony that her mother has caused her. But one of the most recurring sources of resentment is Annie's constant pressure to mold her daughter into an image of herself, which Lucy sees as submissive, unambitious, and content when Lucy doesn't think she should be. And so Lucy admits that they do share many traits, but she's disgusted by her mother's complacency, specifically in marrying her own father, who casually engaged in countless affairs right in front of her face. Lucy long recognized that this sort of subservience really wasn't in her own nature. And therefore, how could it be in the nature of the woman from which I came? You know, like surely she is forcing herself into subjection. And so while she constantly seeks out her mother's love throughout the book, well, I guess not throughout the book, when she was a child, she eventually found it transient and conditional. I had come to feel that my mother's love for me was designed solely to make me into an echo of her, and I didn't know why, but I felt that I would rather be dead than just become an echo of someone. So Lucy chose to disappear and leave her mother to grieve her, basically. Now, Lucy began mourning her mother's love probably 10 years prior to her departure. She calls it perhaps the one true love in my whole life that I would ever know. And the source of the relationship's deteriorations is pretty identifiable with the birth of her first brother, which was then followed by 2 more brothers. And Annie kind of reserved all of her expressions of pride exclusively for her son's achievements. She was energetic and eager when she was supporting their endeavors. But as her mother's emotional investment was kind of diverted to her sons, Lucy's potential was either unrecognizable or suppressed, and both to Lucy were equally painful. Her mother, her creator, her God, discarded her. And what do you do when God betrays you? Now, Lucifer's story in Paradise Lost kind of runs parallel to this. God announces that all of his angels must bow to his son, the Christ, who would be elevated above them. And Lucifer, who was a high-ranking angel, long devoted to God's service, felt profoundly betrayed by this kind of unfounded command of subordination. How could another just so effortlessly steal away the love and the honor that Lucifer thought he deserved? And so, gripped by pride, envy, and pain, Lucifer launches a rebellion. And, he's going against God. So, in kind of a fated defeat, he and his followers are cast from heaven and doomed to wander hell and earth, eternally separated from their creators. Both Lucy and Lucifer, mobilized by the pain of betrayal, kind of lost their homes, their paradises, and ultimately their places alongside their creators in rebellion. Now, it's important to kind of note that Lucifer never hated God, not even after the banishment. His feelings were kind of a tormenting mix of broken pride and resentment, desperation and anguish. But he knows that God is all-knowing, and all-powerful and all-just. He is kind of admitting that in various parts of the epic. And in some ways he knows that his suffering is his own doing, but even if there was room for reconciliation, Lucifer's ego, however bruised it may be, just wouldn't allow for it. But hatred is an easier emotion to describe and to navigate, both externally and internally. And Lucy also knows that she doesn't hate her mother, but it's easier to convince herself that she does than to try to assemble shattered pieces of a relationship that once was, analyzing how and when and where each shard fell, identifying the emotions that each prick ignites. Hatred here is kind of a coping mechanism, and it doesn't leave room for empathy, for concession, for remorse. So try as they may, neither Lucifer nor Lucy will ever really be able to fully detach themselves from their creator, because Lucifer can't evade the omnipotent, omnipresent God that crafted him from the same heavenly bodies that he expelled him from, and Lucy can't discard her mother without discarding herself. I had spent so much time saying I did not want to be like my mother that I missed the whole story. I was not like my mother, I was my mother, and I could see now why. To the few feeble attempts I made to draw a line between us, her reply was always, "You can run away, but you cannot escape the fact that I am your mother. My blood runs in you. I carried you for 9 months inside of me." How else was I to take such a statement but as a sentence for life in a prison whose bars were stronger than any iron imaginable? Now, this is another really, for me, really interesting note that I kind of picked up on when I was reading through it. And I went back and scoured each page to make sure I was right. And I think I am, but if I'm not, feel free to correct me. But aside from the title itself, Lucy's name is not explicitly mentioned in the text until page like 149. Pretty dang close to the end of the book. And it's mentioned as she's combing through personal documents. Lucy Josephine Potter. Where did Josephine come from? Lucy Josephine Potter. And the detail's really subtle. It doesn't jump out at you, but I guess, it jumped out at me enough for me to notice it. But withholding her name, I think, until that late in the novel was pretty deliberate on Kincaid's part. The entire novel up until this point has been about Lucy's struggle with identity, independence, and kind of pervasive indignation. There's a lot of people who don't like Lucy's character at all throughout the book. I like her, but that's a big debate. Do you even like the main character? Like, she's kind of I won't say it, but so she recounts a memory from childhood in which she asks her mother why she named her Lucy. And her mother at first pretended that she didn't hear her. And then when Lucy repeats herself, her mother says under her breath, "I named you after Satan himself. Lucy, short for Lucifer. What a botheration from the moment you were conceived." But instead of taking offense, young Lucy kind of embraces this association, because perhaps Satan did better represent her own values of defiance and independence and pride. Perhaps her conscious decision to accept Satan or Lucifer's name as her own emboldened her to defy her mother and kind of send herself into self-exile. Because after all, if she was Satan and her mother was a saint, there was no hope for reconciliation. What could be expected from two naturally warring deities? At least this identity was her own, and it embodies everything that her mother stood against. And for that, Lucy felt triumphant. So at the end of both of their stories, both of our anti-heroes, which are Lucy and Lucifer, they achieved separation from their makers. However, in both narratives, freedom kind of proves to be more isolating than redeeming. Even after repeated rejection of her mother's authority, Lucy can't escape her influence. It makes up her own flesh and blood. And the further Lucy removes herself, the more her mother's words ring true, that Lucy's home could never be anywhere but with her. So just like Lucifer, Lucy chose autonomy over obedience, fully aware of what that would cost her. There's no reconciliation, there's no return to paradise. Instead, Lucy kind of ends with a quiet reckoning, and that is that defiance doesn't detach one's identity from its origin. So while severance is successful, paradise is lost. in both of their cases. That's all I've got. Like I said, it's definitely a little bit more of an analysis for people who have already read Lucy, because it would be painfully long if I were to get a little bit further into the plot. But hopefully this helps somebody out. Yeah, I liked it. I liked Lucy. There was a lot of discourse, like even in class, about whether or not we liked the protagonist, sort of, because she is an anti-hero throughout the book, you know, like she's pretty dang bitter and kind of unpleasant and doesn't always treat people well, and she's got a lot of reasoning behind it in some areas, and in other areas you're like, dang, kind of messed up. But I liked her. I like female characters like that. I feel like we don't have enough of them, and I think Kincaid is a wonderful writer. If you, for some reason, have watched this and haven't read it, read it. It's pretty good. I don't think I spoiled that much, but yeah. Hope this helps. I didn't know Photo Booth did that.